When you think about learning to drive, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Passing the test, right? But what if I told you that focusing only on that one goal is actually what makes so many new drivers dangerous? Today, we're going to look at a totally different way to think about it, one that changes the goal from just a 40-minute exam to a whole lifetime of being safe on the road. Let's dive in.
So let's start with a really important question, one that's kind of baffling when you stop and think about it. Why is it that so many drivers, right after they get that shiny new license, end up in an accident? I mean, they've proved they can drive, they passed the test. So what is going wrong out there in the real world?
Well, it all comes down to something that driver education experts call the test pass trap. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's this mental trap we fall into where the short-term goal, just passing the test, completely takes over and we lose sight of the real goal, becoming a safe, confident driver for life.
When we're stuck in this trap, every single lesson becomes about one thing: how to perform for an examiner for 40 minutes. This creates a ton of anxiety, and it encourages this really shallow, surface-level learning. Like just memorizing the test routes instead of actually understanding how to handle unpredictable traffic. And this brings us to a really crucial idea: the difference between mastery goals and performance goals. When you have a mastery goal, you're focused on truly understanding how the car works, how the road works. Mistakes aren't failures, they're just opportunities to learn. But with performance goals, your focus is just on looking good for the test, trying to avoid mistakes at all costs. And that second approach, it leads to way more anxiety and, most importantly, much weaker skills in the long run.
Okay, so how do we escape this trap? We need a new map, right? A better way to understand what driving actually is. And that brings us to what's known as the 4 levels of driving. This new map is called the Goals for Driver Education Matrix, or the GDE matrix for short. And the idea behind it is pretty simple, but it's also kind of revolutionary. Driving isn't just one skill. Nope, it's a hierarchy of skills, and the choices you make at the very top of that hierarchy directly affect how you're physically controlling the car at the bottom.
So let's build this thing. Sometimes it's called the driving pyramid. At the very bottom, at level 1, you've got your basic vehicle control. Steering, braking, using the clutch. Then level 2 is all about mastering traffic, dealing with other cars, pedestrians, cyclists. Now this is where most driving lessons stop, but the pyramid goes way higher. Level 3 is about your goals for the journey itself. Are you late for a meeting, or are you just out for a relaxing Sunday drive? And at the very top, level 4, that's all about you. Your personality, your values, your attitude towards risk.
And here is the absolute key to the whole thing. A failure at a lower level is almost always just a symptom of a problem at a higher level. So if you're speeding, that's a level 2 error. The problem usually isn't that you don't know how to take your foot off the gas. The real problem is often at level 3, like you're late for work, or even at level 4, like you have a risk-taking personality. The why you drive completely controls the how you drive.
So, once we have this new map of what driving is, we need the right tools to actually use it. And that is where setting smarter goals comes into play. Goals that tackle all 4 levels of that pyramid, not just the stuff at the bottom.
You've probably heard of this before. The gold standard here is the SMART framework. Your goals need to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So instead of a fuzzy goal like, I want to get better at parking, a SMART goal is super clear. By the end of this lesson, I will perform a reverse parallel park correctly 3 times in a row. Now that is a target you can actually aim for.
And of course, your goals have to evolve as you get better. In your very first lesson, your goal is going to be pure level 1, just don't stall the car. But by lesson 20, you should be setting goals way up at level 3, like plan a route to a new place and think about the best time to go to avoid traffic. You've got to climb that pyramid.
But, and this is a really big but, just because you have a goal doesn't automatically mean it's a good one. In fact, one of the most common goals that drivers set for themselves is actually incredibly dangerous.
So what's that dangerous goal? Getting there faster. Research shows this over and over again. When a driver's main focus is on cutting down their journey time, it almost always leads to aggressive driving. We're talking tailgating, speeding, risky overtakes. We feel like we're slicing huge chunks of time off our trip, but the actual data tells a very, very different story.
15 seconds? That's about how much time an aggressive driver actually saves on a typical trip. Think about that. You massively increase your chance of a crash, you stress yourself out, you burn more gas, all to save less time than it takes to tie your shoes. It's just a terrible trade-off.
All right, so setting the right goals is huge, but it's only half the story.
There's another really common myth we need to bust, and that's the idea that just putting in more hours behind the wheel is going to automatically make you a better driver. It won't, because experience is not the same thing as expertise.
The thing that turns that raw experience into actual skill is something called reflective practice. It's the simple act of thinking about what you're doing. Because without it, you don't get 100 hours of driving experience. You just get the same first hour of experience repeated 100 times, bad habits and all.
So how do you do this whole reflection thing? Does it have to be complicated? Not at all. In fact, one of the most powerful coaching tools in the world just boils down to a couple of really simple questions.
At the end of a trip, or even just after a tricky maneuver, just ask yourself this. On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident did I feel doing that? And then, here's the magic part. What stopped it from being a 10? That second question is what forces you to dig deeper. Maybe it wasn't your steering that was the problem. Maybe it was the pressure you felt from the car behind you. This is how you start to understand those higher levels of the pyramid.
So, let's put all the pieces together. When you combine this 4-level pyramid with setting smart goals and actually practicing reflection, you completely change the whole point of learning to drive.
The test stops being this big, scary final boss you have to defeat. Instead, it just becomes a byproduct of your skill. It's just a little checkpoint you'll pass along the way on your real journey, which is becoming a safe and confident driver for life. The focus shifts from just performing to truly mastering the skill.
So, if you're going to take anything away from this, make it these 4 points. 1. Driving is a hierarchy. Your attitude and your goals for the trip have a huge impact on how you use the pedals and the steering wheel. 2. Set mastery goals. Focus on learning for real, not just putting on a show for the test. 3. Reflection is everything. Thinking about your driving is what turns hours in the car into actual skill. And finally, number 4, use coaching questions. Ask yourself, what stopped that from being a 10, to figure out what's really going on.
So, I'll leave you with this final question to think about. Whether you're a learner driver, a parent helping someone practice, or even if you've been driving for years, just ask yourself, are you focused on a 40-minute test or on a lifetime of safe journeys? Because the answer to that question changes everything.